Alright, that Yu-Gi-Oh video. Let's see what we did. 40k. That's a lot of fucking views. Well, maybe if that did well, this will probably do well. So, V-Series. This was definitely... I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it to you. This was like the worst time to be in Vanguard, I swear. And it makes it so funny to me because V Premium literally just left. I don't know everyone else's thoughts about that, but it was cathartic for me. V-Series, I would put about like maybe 85% of the reason why I didn't want to play Vanguard anymore. It just had so many problems just for Overdress to be like the straw that broke the camel's back. And I'm gonna be honest, I think a video like this kinda needs to just be made. I think people truly forgot how bad V-Series was. And I think with all the nostalgia, especially with the units coming back from that era, I think people got a little bit complacent. There's definitely a lot to talk about. And forewarning, this is probably gonna get a little emotional. So, yeah, just as a warning. However, before we talk about series, we need a little context beforehand so that you can understand why I'm so critical about it. So before we talk about V-Series and its problems, let's just talk a little bit about G-Era. Alright, the first question, because I'm pretty sure a lot of people are gonna think that I'm gonna just glaze G-Era for the entirety. Was G-Era perfect? No. I'll even put a hell in front of it. Hell no. Just like everything else in the world, G-Era wasn't perfect and had a lot of bad things going on. I think one of them was definitely just Gear Chronicle as a whole. Gear Chronicle just felt like good stuff the deck. It didn't really have like a gimmick worth mentioning. It was just a gimmick of something else but better. It was very consistent, very powerful, always topped, always got support. A lot of other clans kind of had that, but if you had to really put it on one clan to represent it all, Gear Chronicle would be that thing. So if you're thinking of only doing G-Era stuff, you just gotta remember that that clan was a fucking travesty. I think the second thing to talk about is definitely the power creep. Was there some power creeps happening in G-Era? Of course, that's always gonna happen in a card game. However, at the end of its lifespan, G-Era really put in power creep, and I don't know why. I think to represent this clearly, it was definitely old Luard support and Gize just existing. Basically, your deck at the time kind of had to revolve around thinking about if Gize was going to hit the field. And of course, he's fine now, but he was really a problem back then, and the only reason why he's not a problem anymore is because of the power level and just for the fact that there's so many things that you can do in order to interact with it. The third thing was prices, and it's very weird to talk about considering the fact that Bushiroad has gotten worse over the years, even after V-Series and after everything with prices, but back then I've heard that it was also a problem. The reason why it wasn't really a problem with me is because I always chose cards where it's like the main deck only had like $40, maybe $50, and then like most of the money was spent on like extra deck cards. So that's why it didn't really affect me compared to a lot of people that really wanted to get into the competitive scene in order to dump huge money on things that are like the most consistent thing possible and all that. But that was never a thing that happened to me. I think these were definitely the biggest problems of G-Era, and if you have any additional ones that you can talk about, please talk about it in the comments, because I'm going to be honest, G-Era has been so long ago that it's really hard to recollect all the ideas and all the things that happened back then. What are easy for me in order to talk about in G-Era are the positives though, so let's just get into some of them. The mechanic of Stride was really balanced. Listen, I agree that certain cards during like G-Era, especially the Stride cards, were incredibly good, maybe even downright broken. I'm not even gonna, you can have that. However, what I will argue is that Stride as a mechanic was way ahead of its time. Shrine kind of fixed a lot of problems that I had with card games back then. And it's just the fact that going first is just so powerful. Whether I played Yu-Gi-Oh!, whether I played Buddy Fight, going first probably impacted every single one's turns more than most any other plays could. But with Shrine, it made this thing sort of interesting. You can interact with the opponent without even really using things like hand traps or even other spell cards. Because in order to Shrine, you both had to be in grade 3, so going first doesn't really mean that you're out of the game. The person going second actually has kind of a little advantage, but the fact that you get free draws and you also get the chance in order to get a critical trigger on your first turn, that's still really impactful and makes it so that the game is a little dynamic. This was very apparent in grade 2 stalling. See, I'm going to mention him later, but a very good card, or to me at least, a good card that I used to run in G-Era was Claret Sword Dragon. Not that version, the other one. There we go. The way how I built Claret Sword Dragon was very defensive, which means that compared to Luard, compared to Blaster Dark Diablo, I wasn't as aggressive as other decks. This means that in order to really last, I needed alternative things in order to grind out the game. And how I did that was grade 2 gaming people. I paid like maybe 4 cents for a grade 2 vanilla card. I put 4 copies in there, maybe like another 2 copies just to have it. And I grade 2 game people, and I just retired their units, slowly chipped at them until they just finally went grade 3 so that I could strike first and do some damage. That sort of interaction, ingenious. And I don't see it in most other card games. The fact that running a 10k vanilla versus everyone else's 9ks during that point was impactful just blows my mind to this very day. It really vibed well with the back and forth nature that I really got with Premium at the time in G-Era. You mix this with the endless amounts of variety that you can get because of a format like that, and it was incredible. Sure, you had cards like Blaster Dark Diablo, sure, you had cards like Luard on the battlefield, and that was kind of boring, kind of aggressive, you know? But then you had people like me that actually could win with Claret Sword Dragon, even though it's just a defensive dark deck. And that was across everything. Like, G-Era had so many, like, varying decks and varying strategies that didn't even have to include Shrine. They just used Shrine to help their strategies out. Some people still use Limit Break at the time. Some people even use Legion Mate at the time with certain decks. It was just a very good format to see a lot of, like, unique strategies that you usually don't see. Seeing some of the best Spike Brothers cards just still use like Limit Break to this very day, at least in that format, was just fun. You truly saw people really just use decks that they really loved. Maybe not to the point in the competitive scene, because, you know, I didn't really know about the competitive scene at the time. I knew it existed, and even my friend at the time played against those competitive decks. I was just in it for the ride. But the fact that I saw so many people just run cards, not because that they were powerful, but because that they liked them and they liked the gimmicks to them, were just amazing. These are the types of things that I loved about G-Era, and I get really nostalgic over it. So much so that I want to build like a G-Era deck again just to see how it feels. But it's truly what I think. G-Era had all these great positives, all these great things to it, and a lot of things that just made me truly love the game. And I understand that it had a lot of negative things. I get you. But overall, G-Era was just fun. It was interactive, skill intensive. A lot of people just ran decks that they really loved. It was truly just a great time. Which feels awful, because now we're going to talk about V-Series. I'm going to warn every single person before they move forward. I am going to be incredibly anal about V-Series. There is actually not a lot of positives that I can really bring up in V-Series compared to something like G-Era. And I know that I'm a biased person. But even so, I'm gonna just tell you how it is. So if you think that I'm already going to be too harsh, or you don't really want to hear it, I'm giving you one last warning. Now that I've done that, let's do this. I said earlier on in the video that I truly believe that people just don't remember how ass V-Series was. Even when it came to the first 2 sets of V-Series, you can clearly see some bad things that were already coming. The problem was, at the time, I was way younger, so what I was worried about wasn't the fact of little things like that. It was just the fact of, am I going to have fun with this new card game with my friends? I never really got into it until I became older. And because of that, I didn't really see how it was broken from the start. Let's talk about the mechanics. The mechanic that was specifically introduced into the game of V-Series was markers. And it's very funny because even beforehand, people knew something was up about this mechanic. If you don't know, a marker works like this. If you ride with a grade 3 that has this symbol, you get a bonus effect. Depending on where the clan ends up on the marker triangle, you get that specific effect. At first, we only got 3 markers. After time passed, we got an additional 3. Force 1, Force 2, Axel 1, Axel 2, Protect 1, and Protect 2. Off rip, we fucked the game. Because remember, back then, the old mechanic was Stride. You both had to be at grade 3 in order to Stride, and if you fought against it, it could be a real tug of war. Markers do the opposite. When you ride a grade 3 with marker, you get the marker immediately. Guess what, guys? Going first is great again, like it has never been good in a card game ever. God damn it. Why didn't we just rule it so that both players have to be at grade 3 in order to get a marker? This is stupid. The second problem was that you could stack these things. I don't think it was a problem beforehand, but after a few years of the marker system being here, we had a lot more cards just get multiple markers onto the field for literally nothing. I'm not going to talk about power creep now, but add on to the fact that power creep existed in V-Series and it really made it worse. It just made it so that turns just never fucking last in this game. You can, I think after like turn 3, like maybe like 2, maybe 3 turns if you're lucky. This is going to be the third thing about it, and I don't know if people will agree with this, but adding the second marker made it so that shit didn't really matter. What do I mean by that? Okay, look at this, right? We have marker 1 and marker 2 of force. 1 makes it so that you gain a lot of power, 10,000 for each marker, and you can place it anywhere. The second one is just for crits. Now, why is this bad? This is bad because a person that choose one or the other is just because they don't have access to the other one. If you're already building your thing in order to have power, you might as well have crit to go on top of it. If you're the reverse and you have a way in order to get like only crit, guess what? You're gonna focus on the power now. I'm gonna use this clan in other examples, but Dimensional Robo throughout all of its time in V-Era really felt like this. There is not a lot of reason in order to use Force 2 in Dimensional Robos. Because the deck revolves around getting like a lot of power and then getting either multiple drives or multiple rides because of the power, there's almost no reason to run like Force 2. So if your deck had a weakness, it's basically gone now. And if your deck was already good at something, now the power for it just shot up to 1,000,000%. There's different problems with other markers though. Axel 1 and 2, the reason why it was a problem is because Axel 2 was just always the card that you would run. Sure, you gave another zone like 10,000 and you can attack with it, but a lot of cards were only like 8k or maybe even 9k, so you would only attack with 19, making it so that someone can really just use 5k or 10k in order to actually defend with it. With Axel 2 though, you can just summon grade 1s that are 8k, hit the line that is 13k for most force units, and also get a draw. There was almost no reason to run Axel 1 once Axel 2 comes into play. Protect 1 and 2 kind of has this problem, but I'm gonna be honest, I don't really feel any way towards it. Like, most of the decks that I would run Protect in, I would always do Protect 1 just because it was the better one out of the two. There were some decks that can use, like, the second one, but it wasn't really many, so it kind of had the same problem. Off rip, these markers had a problem, and they never got solved. Everything that G-Era did well is now basically down the drain. Speaking of hitting force units, can we talk about the power? 13k versus 12k was fucking dumb. G-Era solved this problem by just making every single unit be 11k. There was only a few cards in the game that really broke this rule. A few, maybe. This was for consistency. This was to be clear. This was so that to do magic numbers, you don't really need to do a lot of addition or things like that. Making separate marker clans have separate power is fucking dumb. All it did was make Axel decks beforehand, like before a lot of support came out, just really dig under their heels and be garbage. And Protect clans were just good for the fact that they can deal with Force clans because guess what, power doesn't matter. I really don't know why they changed power aspects, even considering the fact that later on down the line, they just made Axel 2 so that they can hit magic numbers anyway. So like, what was the point of changing the power of certain decks based on markers? It just didn't make sense, and once you pair that with the markers themselves, it made it so that it was just more annoying than anything else. This mechanic didn't feel like it was built to last. This mechanic felt like it was built for fucking casuals, so that they can just like do whatever they can and just turn off their brain. Now that we've gotten that out the way, let's talk about the power creep. The power creep in V-Series didn't tone down a bit until like the literal end of the era. Even the first set of clan units that came out were clearly just pushed in order for everyone to deal with some bullshit. I remember pretty clearly when Oracle Think Tank was the best deck at the time, and it was just annoying as shit. But I think even before that, one of the worst decks that you had to face back then that were like meta relevant, I put on quotes, was like Waterfall Dragon. Oh my god, that's nostalgic. Fucking Waterfall Dragon. Imagine having to deal with that shit. But as time went on, we just kept getting worse and worse. Just one set after another, more and more cards get better draws, get more power, get more crits, get more drive. It was fucking insane. A lot of people talked about it. I think a lot of YouTubers actually talked about like the excessive power going on for sets, but it's like, I don't know. I think after all this time, it really makes me feel like they just didn't care. And that was kind of just everyone else at the time. Sure, it was powerful, but I guess we were having fun, right? I guess. Two cards make me really question that, and even the community have a hard time even accepting that as well. That was definitely Overlord, the X, and also Luard. I think these decks just really put a wrench in everyone's moods when it came to the game in general, when it came to power creep. Again, power creep was already there even in the first few sets, but it was when these cards came out that people actually had to realize and had to actually really complain about it. Luard being the worst out of it. Look at this, you could just ride into Overlord, have a unit that gives you a lot of power, put like Force 2 on it, you get multiple drive, and you can attack again. It was the definition of brain dead. I'll talk about the brain dead aspect a little more later on, just put a pin on it though. But in general, the power creep was so immense that even when one set came out after another, it wasn't like 6 months down the road, it wasn't like a year and a half of cards just being okay and then we had a big one. No, it was set after set after set of just keep on increasing the power, increase the draw, increase the amount of markers. It was just, why? But I guess no one really cared because a lot of the nostalgic units that you didn't get in the past were there now, and now they're powerful. I guess being powerful would be fine if, like, the design of most of these cards were cool, but they're just not. Every deck just can't be offensive or just defensive. They have to be both. A card can't just give you power. A card can't just give you draws. A card can't just give you one drive. It has to be all in one. I'm just going to use Die Liner as an example just because it's pretty apparent this problem. Die Liner isn't just a card where you can just get resources and use it for defensive options. No. You draw the card if you search it, you gain 20k from it, you get a crit, and then you can use it to block later on. You see how this design aspect has kind of corrupted a lot of V-Series cards? A lot of V-Series cards is cards that, like, do them all instead of just doing in one, and you have certain weaknesses and you just deal with it in order to have an interesting game state. Look at fucking Season 1, the original Cardfight for, like, Spike Brothers. Spike Brothers, you needed to invest a lot of cards in order to do a lot of attacks in order to get people down to, like, 5 damage. There was a weakness to it. You didn't have a lot of cards in order to use defensively. You had to use their cards in order to go for attacking, and it was fine. But if you ignore that aspect of design and everything just has to be good, you just get decks that just do it all, and it just makes them uninteresting. Not to glaze G-Era again, but look at my Clarisor Dragon deck. It's basically only used in order to get really good defensive pushes, really control the opponent, haggle with them, and then finally do one big punch to their face to see if I can make it. I'm not like Diablo, I'm not like Loire where I can draw everything and also attack. I have to invest in only being defensive. It made games interesting, and it made sort of matchups have some more meaning than just everyone is good at everything. I had a Royal Paladin guy, and he played Brave. He had good matchups against Narukami, but when it came to his matchups with Clarisor, he had problems. His deck usually can just attack all he can to Narukami, and they just had nothing in order to stop the oppression. Me, I had ways to stop it, and we had to tussle a few times. These plays do not happen in V-Series, because everyone is good at everything. It makes it so that, at least in V-Era, and we'll talk about it later, but in Premium, a lot of the reasons why you won was just because your deck was built better. It wasn't about the actual plays that you had to do against someone, you know, attacking rear guards, maybe so that they don't get the 4th damage, making it so that they ride into a certain thing. It doesn't happen in this era. And that's because most of it can just be ignored because so many people have the power now to just ride grade 3 first turn, get a good marker, do a lot of damage, and also retain cards. There is no strategies that you can do in order to really fight this because you're fighting card design at this point. You're not fighting the player, you're fighting the cards. Not only that, but it made cards boring as shit. Card design in this era was just about power, draw, crit, drive, and then that's it. When it came to the strategies, it actually didn't matter because the only thing that happens is that the strategy is so that we can get to these bonus effects, so we can get the crit, so we can get the drive, so we can get the markers. How you play your deck actually really doesn't matter. It's just really about the power and the draw and the crit. That's it. I already talked about it before, this is how power creep came to the game, but it also meant that actual interesting cards that were released didn't have a fucking chance. If you don't know about them, here's a few good ones that because power creep was a thing, and because the era is how it is, you can't really play them. Seal Dragon Blockade and Lawkeeper are some of the most interesting control decks that you could ever play in the V-Era. Seal Dragon really revolved around your opponent having grade 2s as the main gimmick beforehand, but it incorporated a lot of things just in case people didn't have the grade 2 option. If your opponent had grade 2 units and they retire them, cool, they get 10,000 for each, cool. If there wasn't any retired units, you get an Imaginary Force card, cool. And if your opponent tried to play around it by not using any grade 2 cards, guess what? You get an original crit of 2. Do I agree that it can be annoying? Yes, but it also means that the player has to be dynamic with the opponent. You can't just sit there and just keep gaining your resources and doing nothing. The board state actually matters. And it's really apparent if you compare it to something like Dragonic Vanquisher. Dragonic Vanquisher technically doesn't need your opponent to actually look at the board state, because you can just bind your own cards in order to get the first effect. And then not only that, it actually has a stupid effect where the opponent actually has to bind cards in hand. So at least with, you know, Blockade, you get to keep the cards that you have. You just have to actually determine which to guard with. With Dragonic Vanquisher, the opponent doesn't matter, and not only that, they're getting rid of their resources to guard. Then you have Dragonic Lawkeeper. Lawkeeper gets abilities depending on how many rear guards your opponent has. And as a defensive option, he can bind the cards. So if your opponent is trying to ignore your first ability, what they can do is that if they don't have any back rows, all your units gain 5,000 power, and it's permanent. If they have no rear guards at all, they get an additional 5,000. Both of these cards really make it so that the game is more dynamic. And I know a lot of people don't like control sort of aspects of cards, especially since, you know, people don't like dominate, people don't like cards that lock. I understand that. But these are more dynamic ways in order to deal with your opponent. And not only that, but they still have options to do something. Again, unlike Vanquisher. And they're interesting. Not only does it affect the board, but they also take something that's very interesting. Blockade deals with grade 2s. The other one deals with the fact that your opponent can attack you defensively. So Blockade uses it usually offensively, while this one uses defensively. But guess fucking what? Why would you ever think about using these cards ever if Dragonic Overlord the X and also Soen is illegal? Why pick cards that actually are interesting in order to deal with the opponent's shit when you can just kill them? That was V-Series' biggest problem. It's because most of these actual interesting cards could have been great to use against the opponent in order to make really good dynamic games, but the power creep and not only the power creep, but just making them boring as hell because all they deal with is power, crits, and drive. It just made it so goddamn boring, especially when it's every set, after every set, after every set. Almost every deck felt the same. And it wasn't just those cards. Darkface Ghidorah is another good control card that was here, and it was used, and it was actually fun to use against people. But the problem is that once a better Mega Colony unit came into play, why even care? Especially since a lot of like force cards were Vanguard centric, so you couldn't really kill them or do anything. Imagine having Ghidorah just to face someone that only pumps their like Vanguard. It defeats the purpose. Swarmshroud Dragon could have been an entirely good anti-meta pick. Its ability has never really been seen in V-Series and actually has to put players on their toes when they play it. They can't just call every single combo piece that they have and use them later. If they call their pieces and they get binded or bound, guess what? If Swarmshroud Dragon got to Soul Blast its grade 3, it would be a grind game afterward. But guess what? This interesting card that would have made a really good headway, guess what? Power creep, power, draw, crit. Because other cards are just better than it on outset, why would you run this card at all? Brufus was actually a decent combo deck, but you actually needed to, I don't know, use your brain for it. If one of your cards already got into the damage zone, you had to fix that. And Brufus didn't really have a lot of ways in order to do a lot of damage early. So basically, you had a good deck that had an ender of legs. I understand, legs is broken, but just stay with me here. You had an ender with legs, right? And you had to grind your way in order to get like 3 of the same 3 copies into your soul in order to activate your other effects. But they were so powerful that it incentivized you in order to run this card effectively. Especially, again, I say this again, this deck beforehand, like back then, not now, but Rufus beforehand didn't have a lot of ways in order to give your opponent damage like a lot of other Force clans. So even when you actually got the combo off, your opponent would still probably be at 4 or 5 damage, so you had to fix that yourself. That's what made it interesting. It had a weakness, and you had to follow through with that weakness, rather than being like Soen, or being like Dieliner, or being like every other card that not only draws, you also get power, you also get crit, you also get defensive options, you just get everything in one. Trust me, there was more actual interesting cards in V-Era that I haven't talked about. I was actually going to make a video on it, but whatever. There were a lot of really good, decent cards that had a very interesting card design when it came to V-Era. But the problem was just everything else that it revolved around. You had the markers that were already broken, dumb, and definitely not balanced. You had power creep, and with power creep, these cards that were decent beforehand, guess what? If you got no support, it's just in the dumps, garbage. Every single other card that came to the game were not just defensive, but also offensive, and had a lot of ways to draw. Everyone is just good, so it's just boring. And because of that, you had, at least to me, a lot of V-Era was just fucking boring as shit, because a lot of the reasons of why that I won against people were simply because my deck was better, and it wasn't really because of any strategies that I can perform. My friend, the Blazing Conqueror, I don't know where he is anymore, but I hope he's doing okay. We used to battle a lot when it came to this game. And, you know, he used to run Vanquisher and all that, and I found it very annoying, right? Of course, you know, petty stuff, I know. But, again, we face each other in V-Era, right? Sometimes I try my best in order to actually face them. I use every single strategy in the book that I ever knew from G-Era in order to try to beat his deck, and I just couldn't do it. My card draw wasn't as good, my power wasn't as good, and all that. But then guess what? Majesty Lord Blaster came onto the scene, and I bought it because I love Majesty Lord Blaster. But then do you know what happened right afterward that I bought that deck? I just never lost. Every single XL deck he ever had, even if it wasn't Vanquisher, just lost against me. And most of the wins that I got were simply because that I just had more force markers than him. I had more draws than him. I had more ways in order to just beat the game early. And that fucking sucks. The game used to have like a lot of intrinsic stuff that you can do against your opponent that wasn't just switching your cards. It used to be really interesting. But if you add this dumb marker stuff, power creep, and also the fact that everyone is good, then I'm not having a game. The game is playing for me. I'm not actually having an engaging time with my friend. And this happened for years. I don't want to say the worst, because we'll get to the worst. But one of the most awful things that happened because of this was sets afterward. Do you guys remember the extra sets that were happening for a few years, you know, like Zeal, like Enigma Storm and all those cards? Do you remember how they weren't good, or they weren't as good as you know that they could be? Did you ever notice how a lot of them seemed as though they were just copying from other decks, and they were actually even less lukewarm than what we already got in main sets? Well, guess what? That's because of the power creep. Certain cards like Zeal, certain cards like Enigma Storm should have been better than what they are, but because we were at a point where everything was so broken, they just decided to stop making good cards in general, and it really did hurt a lot of decks. It was so weird because we dealt with power creep so much that it just ended a little bit at the end of the series, only for our card design for certain cards to just turn ass. It was a double-edged sword. Like, sure, the other cards were broken, but now these cards that I'm winning for right now can't deal with Overlord the X. They can't deal with all these cards that were so good that people ran. It's ridiculous. And I think the worst part, the very worst part, was because everything was so broken, certain abilities just had to be changed. I'm going to use Claret Sword Dragon and Reiji to just represent this. The V-Series Claret Sword Dragon is the worst thing to befall man. Not only is his design looking like a stupid-ass retarded All Might, but because Luard already had Ritual, guess what? Now nobody can have Ritual. Also, just in case nobody knows, Ritual is just the effect where a lot of Shadow Paladins in the G era like dumped grade 1 cards, and as you had more and more grade 1s, you can fill a sort of line where you can get effects based on that. So that's what it is. Because Luard was so good, and because grade 1s were so good, Claret Sword used to revolve around grade 1s. There was one version where you just summon it from deck, and you could summon anything as long as it was grade 1, and there was the other one that I use where you summon 2, but it's random, but you can use them defensively. This Claret Sword does neither. Not only do you just dump the shits to the graveyard, but you also have to bind that amount. Oh, great. So not only does Overlord the X get to do shit for free, but get more of a boost compared to this card, but not only that, but I have to risk my deck, risk my options, sacrifice my resources just for nothing. I have to bind all these cards that I would want in the graveyard for other effects just so I can get something that isn't as good as Overlord the X. It's fucking stupid. Like, I get it. I already said that I would rather a card only be offensive or defensive or draw cards rather than all three of them. But in V era, we had so many cards that were so good at the time that giving us an underpower card is just fucking us. And not only that, it didn't even do what it originally did back in G era. So you just made this effect. You made him bind cards because guess what? You can't balance Luard, so everyone else has to suffer. Look at Blamewing Reiji. Blamewing Reiji used to be fucking cool. You rolled this card multiple times so you can get a lot of cards into the soul, and then permanently you get crit too. And because it, it had 10k, you had to spend other resources in order to pump it up. So it was a really, like, I don't know if it made like top tier sense or anything like that, but it was definitely an interesting card. V-Series Reiji feels like they can't balance it around actually getting different cards into the soul. So instead, they just made you randomly bind the cards. And also, you have to bind like 30 just to do like 2 damage. Like, this never happens. Just like Claret Sword, it really feels like you're doing an alternate thing like binding the soul away just because you know that if you didn't do it before, then it would be broken. And it fucking sucks. This card could have been like an alternative Brufus, or like a card you also used in Brufus, where you keep on getting the same amount of cards in like the same deck, and if you have multiple versions of it, then you get multiple effects. But no, you just randomly soul charge, you hope you have 30, you hope your opponent is at 2 damage, or no, not 2 damage, you hope your opponent is at 4 damage, and then you might deal 2, and even then, like, turns don't even last that long anyway, so like, what's the point? Because of power creep, these cards that could have been interesting had to get the shaft, and it sucks. But that in of itself is not even the worst thing because of V-Series. As you all know, I've already talked about how V Premium was basically done. It's over now. But for a long time it wasn't, and it was actually a really good format for people to play, I guess. It would be one thing if V-Era only affected one format that you played, and you could just go to the other format and not have to feel this burn when it came to cards. But you gotta remember that Premium also includes V-Era cards. So as soon as V-Era cards were legal in Premium, everything just got shafted. Remember how in G era where some people even use Limit Break, how some people just used the old mechanics in order to get leeway and just added Stride cards so that we can, I don't know, influence each other's deck and made old decks really good, or at least okay to use against people? Guess what? That shit's over now. V-Era Vanguards are just so much better than everything that's happened beforehand. They have markers, so that's already a plus. Their power was 12k to 13k, so they're always better than the other 11k units. And unlike G-Era, where you had to fight for GB, guess what? Because you had everything now, you don't fight for stride anymore. You just slam your big ass Vanguard that's grade 3 that has all this shit, and you just go to town and do an incredible play against someone. You just get cards, you get draws, you hit them for a lot of damage, and you didn't even have to wait until you strode to do it. After that, Premium went from being a cool thing that you could really play with your friends to have a decent time and interact with people to a fucking shit show. This made it so much worse when they actually gave stride units to V-Era cards and their abilities. Like, you can already do a lot of stuff on your first grade 3 turn. Why do you also get units that actively work with your cards that are already beating everyone? And not only that, but a lot of these cards that were introduced that were specifically made for V-Era cards were either broken or they were just annoying as hell. I know I've already slandered Narukami beforehand, and I should probably use other units in order to prove this point, but let me just do it anyway. Stunverse and Exterminate are like Seal Dragon if it was just the most unfair thing in the goddamn world. So not only do I have to deal with the fact that Dragonic Vanquisher is already just a good card and it already gets rid of resources. There was also Full Bronto that came in here. Yeah, we definitely needed that card to exist. So we already have these two cards and you can do them on your first grade 3 ride. So that's fucking cool as hell. But you're telling me that they also, in Premium, needed these two cards in order to win games? They really needed it that much, huh? They didn't already have power. They didn't already have draw. They didn't already have ways in order to do multiple attacks and to hit for magic numbers. Really? Not only that, some people would say that, well, Blockade feels like I don't really have a choice, and my opponent is always getting some sort of advantage. But the problem is that its advantages for getting its thing are so minimal compared to these stride units. If you're a heavy superior call deck, you just get fucked by Stunverse. Because not only do you get rid of cards that you probably need for combo tools, but not only that, if you do 4 or even 8, most of the cards in your hand are gone forever. It's not even the fact that maybe they're bound from one turn or they come back. No, they're just permanently gone from the game usually. But if your opponent is trying to do the smart option and try to not give you a lot of cards in order to bind, right? Well, guess what? They're just gonna stride into Exterminate. And instead of getting rid of units, instead of, getting rid of your hand size, guess what? You have to deal with the fact, usually, that the front row of your opponent is usually 20k. 20k? 20k, and you can hit magic numbers and get multiple ways in order to summon a lot of cards during the turn. Why? This is just annoying, and it doesn't even feel like I'm a part of the game anymore. It feels like no matter what I do, I'm just always going to get fucked. And the things that I do in order to make plays against the opponent doesn't actually matter. And it's not just Stunverse, it's not just Narukami, it's a lot of fucking cards in Premium. Premium back then used to be very chill, sometimes you might have one card that would actually, warp the game. But now it just feels like every single other deck just has good ways in order to attack early, has good ways to draw, and has good ways in order to do it. And they're all the same. I used to play Spike Brothers back in the day, and it's just, I look at my deck now, and I'm just like, I don't see how this isn't just a Royal Paladin deck. Clans to me just feel like they have never mattered as soon as V-Era showed up, because everyone just gets everything. Your gimmick doesn't matter, because the only thing that actually matters is draw, crits, drive, power. Everything else sucks dick. And this went on and on for years. It would be one thing if V-Series or V-Era was just only in one format, and it didn't affect everything else. But the problem is that it wasn't. It's in premium now, or not now, but you know, it's been here for a long time. It makes everything so fast and so strong to the point where I just don't give a shit. Why should I give a shit about having a good time with my friends playing this game when games don't even last that long and they're never interesting anymore? The old cards that I used to play in G Era don't matter anymore, so I can't even run them. I can't compete in the metagame without using cards with markers. Every single card now feels like it's just the same thing over and over again. And what's worse is that there's no way to go back. There's no way to go back now. Absolutely none. I mean, sure, sometimes you can have fun. I still have a Blau deck that I could probably use against people and still get wins. But it's just not the same. It's not fun. I feel like the skills that I really liked in G-Era just aren't here anymore. And the reason why they aren't is because a company wanted a casual format that abused our nostalgia. And you know what? They won. Spent a lot of money on Viera. Spent a lot of it just for the fact that my favorite cards were actually made again. But with time, I just grew apathetic. And Overdress didn't save it. But that's a video for another time. I feel like this video just needed to be made because I think people just forget what happened with Vanguard. And the hype of it all just took over for a few years. And not a lot of people really go back to it. Sure, there were some interesting things that happened, such as, you know, the new heal triggers. That was pretty cool, I guess. But too late, too little. Vanguard to me used to be really special and used to be something that I really enjoyed. And who knows, maybe if I gave it a second chance now, I would have some enjoyment from the game. But I'm just too burned. Too much has just happened. And I've said this before, but I think the biggest issue is that I can't go back. I can't play G-Era. No one cares anymore. I can't play with my friend. He's gone now. And if that's the case, the only thing that I have now is just a company that probably never cared about me to begin with. I miss G-Era a lot, but the biggest reason why was two things. It was fun, and it didn't feel fake. Viera felt fake. It felt like they did this because they wanted money, and they wanted to sell to people that didn't actually care about the game. And what's worse is that it didn't even pollute one format. It polluted two. So that's where I'm at now. I haven't played the games for years. Just nothing about it, even in Overdress Era, was ever interesting. And that's just it. V-Era wasn't just a bad product. It's kind of the reason why I don't like the game.